Hi, I'm Christopher Ray, and welcome to the second of 3 video lectures about Chang Kuei-hsing's novel, My South Sea's Sleeping Beauty. I recommend that you also take a look at the brief video lecture I made about Chang Kuei-hsing's life and works. In this video lecture, I want to talk about the mode that we find in this novel. This is one that could be termed magical realism, or the fantastic, but to me it's one that certainly suspends us in a state of belief, disbelief, wonder, enchantment, but there are also moments when I feel like Chang Kuei-hsing is also playing with the notion of fairy tales and enchantment by very deliberately disenchanting us and making things very mundane and telling us facts. We have a new type of South Seas fairy tale at work here, albeit one that has other touchstones such as the Disney fantasies and some old Orientalist stories that are kind of like colonial fantasies of a man coming from the outside and having a relationship with a local woman and making her his own. In the previous video lecture, we talked about the South Seas imaginary, and I want to extend that a bit into this fantasy realm, because these fantasies can be very powerful. One story that's been told about China since the 19th century, and even earlier, is that it is a country asleep, but when it wakes up, it will shake the world. And this asleep-awakening binary has been a tremendously influential one in historiography and cultural imaginings. And I think that's one that Chang Kuei-hsing is drawing on in this novel. Fairy tales are supposed to have happy endings where the princess and the prince come together. But this South Sea Sleeping Beauty is still sleeping at the end. And so do we get a happy ending in this novel? And are we awakened when there's this cascade of facts that were given at the end? By the time that we reach the Postman Bear story that is put in the penultimate chapter, I think that we should be on guard for any type of simplistic wrap-up or happy ending. Magical realism or magic realism is a term that's been applied to a whole range of fictional writings. These works may be supernatural, they may be illogical, they may be fantastic, but these supernatural, fantastic, and illogical things are all happening within a somewhat mundane or ordinary or realistic or normal space. And so they're treating the magical as real. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who's often thought of as being one of the standard bearers for this genre or mode, has said that it's a mode of writing that attempts to destroy the line that separates what seems real from what seems fantastic. And I think the key word here is seems. In My South Sea Sleeping Beauty, Suchi several times refers to his magic carpet, but this is something of a carpet of the imagination, a very mundane, everyday object that takes you on fantastical journeys. Some of the most influential writers in this genre or mode are from South America. And so to writers from North America, or people who think that North America is where it's at, that it's the center of literary creativity, they would have to admit that South America, in this case, is the center. And so there's an interesting North-South politics going on even in the reception history of this genre. So what is Chang Kuei-hsing doing that might be unique? Since he's drawing on all of these existing tropes of Disney princesses and sleeping beauties, what makes the South Sea Sleeping Beauty any different? For one thing, Chang Kuei-hsing goes to an extreme in presenting the South Sea's climate as one that penetrates both women and men alike. Here we see Chunxi's bedroom being invaded. The South Seas is a wind, a ball of mud, a fire. It's something that penetrates your body and comes and goes at will and fills you up completely. It is a fecund presence that gives birth to all types of things, like a fish or like a heifer. It creates out-of-body experiences and even time travel wherein you can witness your own birth. It is a place defined by overpowering sensations. In the very first chapter, a baby dies, and then in the South Seas climate, quickly begins to rot. The South Seas inspires imaginings and desires that are often strongly gendered. These men want to return to simple and primal things to elevate and purify their souls. In fact, this so-called return to the primal very quickly collapses these distinctions between civilization and barbarism. But this is not just a singular moment in which reality collapses into fiction or fiction turns into reality. We are in a mode where we keep moving back and forth between a different state, between belief and disbelief, between what is known and what is unknown, between the natural and the supernatural. We have these overlapping sensations. Is that Chunxi or is that Chuntian? I can't really tell. That's a very uncanny resemblance. We have a profusion of language, of just plant names, for example, that seem absolutely marvelous. We are entering a realm of secrets, rumors, uncertainties, passions, transgressions, and extraordinary events. With Sleeping Beauty, we're perhaps most familiar with Disney's adaptation of an earlier fairy tale. And this creates some narrative problems here. How do you tell the story of a character who is asleep for most of the story, who just lies there and does nothing? This is an animated film, and Sleeping Beauty is a character who is in a state of suspended animation. So is Sleeping Beauty alive or dead? Will she ever wake up again, or will she just be trapped in this state permanently? This is what you might think of as a fantastic state of suspension. In the case of my South Sea Sleeping Beauty, obviously we might connect the Sleeping Beauty character to Chunxi since she does fall into a coma, but there's also Mother who is kind of suspended. Her life seems to be on hold. She is biding her time. How about the South Seas of the narrator's consciousness? This is a place of his childhood that is full of memories and trauma, but also desires and longing. And he has these times when he's off in very mundane Taiwan. Is he going to return to the South Seas? Is he going to return to that maternal embrace? The fate of Suqi's character and the South Seas as its own character is also suspended. One rather overwrought metaphor which has been used again and again about China specifically is that China is a nation asleep that will wake up someday, or maybe it will die in its sleep. Scholars have taken Chinese language newspapers from the late 19th century and early 20th century and done keyword analysis in which they have shown that there's a big spike in the incidence of a phrase like China asleep in the 1890s into the 1900s. We see China asleep and awakening being represented in newspaper headlines. We also see it in literary production. So this is, in other words, a trope or an imaginary way of representing a nation. You could say that it's a way of representing China as a fantastic place, nor is this just ancient history. In 21st century novels written in Chinese, you also get the People's Republic of China as being one whose contemporary politics have essentially put the whole nation into a coma, or have instilled amnesia among the populace in which they deny historical realities and they willfully forget things, or they have been drugged into a state of forgetfulness. So this is just to say that in contemporary Chinese politics, the notion of China being asleep or comatose or forgetful is still very prevalent and very political. Of course, the story is not set in mainland China at all. It is set in Borneo and it is set in Taiwan. And in the sections in Taiwan, some interesting things happen. There is a big shift in the narrative tone, as the translator notes in that introduction, but we seem to be entering a realm of disenchantment, even though some of the characters that we meet there, like Kuei, play in the fairy tale cafe. This is where she performs her songs. And some of the posters in the fairy tale cafe are of these cliched, very familiar symbols of the land of make-believe. But just as Kuei's name means dubious in Chinese, we should also be, I think, a little bit dubious about this fairy tale ambiance, since it seems actually quite mundane. The character of Kuei is very strongly associated with fairy tales, not just in the place where she plays music, but even the clothing that she wears. In the previous video lectures, I mentioned the writer Yu Dafu, who disappeared in the Borneo jungle. What I just want to point out here is that we actually have a pattern that is kind of replicated within this novel of when you're in China or when you're in Taiwan, you're in this mundane, relatively safe space. When you go down to Southeast Asia or the island of Borneo specifically, you move into this treacherous realm where anything could happen. And it's a very exciting place, but also one where there's a lot of disappearance and when mysteries abound and fairy tales begin. Chang Kuei-hsing often refers to this carnivorous tropical plant, which will befuddle and put to sleep its prey before consuming them. So nature is actually eating you alive, and it's very easy to see this as a symbol for this broader ecology here. However the natural world of the jungle is consuming people, it is muddling their perception first. We see this plant appearing not just in My South Sea's Sleeping Beauty, but also in other novels like Monkey Cup. Disney's is not the only Sleeping Beauty story that we get in this novel, of course. We also get the story that has very strong colonial overtones about a Chinese man who meets a tribeswoman and has a romantic relationship with her, and they live to unnaturally long life and live happily ever after. And the narrator couches this tale as an Orientalist fantasy that white writers coming to the Orient will come up with in order to satisfy their sentimental projections onto this place. It's worth keeping in mind too that the sleepers in this novel are not all beauties. Before this would-be rapist follows Mother into the jungle, he says to her that she shouldn't put too many sweet-smelling plants close to each other because they could make people fall asleep. After all of the sleeping and all of the reverie and all of these fantastical elements, something significant happens in chapters 29 and 30. This is a very interesting moment in the structure of this novel, where it seems like we wake up, that we've been under this enchantment for a while, and finally we have two characters who just lay out a bunch of facts for us with their own stories. So it's a sudden demystification or disenchantment. First, in chapter 29, we have Lin Yuan's story about what father was really doing and what the relationship between mother, father, and Lin really was. This supposedly explains or justifies or explains away a lot of these extreme acts that we've witnessed and read about in the preceding chapters. Then in chapter 30, suddenly a prince appears. He just comes across the river from Brunei and identifies himself as someone who's gone to these parties and has had relationships with some of these other characters, including what we didn't know, which is that he loved Chunxi, and he's been in love with her ever since they first met, and that he has actually taken her back to Brunei with him, that she did not go to the United States for treatment after all. And this prince seems to know the truth about our narrator and main character, Su Qi, that he was in love not with Chunxi, but with Chuntian, that there's this type of misplaced affection, and so finally he knows the truth and is prompted to acknowledge it. Another thing that happens within the prince's story is that he lays out all of these dates. He finally gives us a chronology for what happened when. So I'm curious, what do you make of this? Do we like this? Are we happy now that we know the truth, that we've got the facts finally, and we can leave all of that fantastical stuff behind? Late in the novel, we seem to be moving towards all of these fairy tale endings, not just in Borneo, but also in Taiwan. So Kei, we learn in her late conversation with Suchi that she had been abused sexually as a child by all these men in the military compound, and that she had also been abused sexually by lesbians as an adult. But now she has left that past behind, and she's even broken ties with this not so charming little prince. And she is now standing on her own 2 feet and economically self-sufficient, and she's on her way to a successful singing career. Chunxi, who we've probably been assuming as the Sleeping Beauty of the novel's title, also gets her prince. He just suddenly shows up and reveals that he's going to take care of her until the end of her days, whether or not she wakes up. Su Qi's mother does not get to kill her husband, but she does extract a measure of revenge. Chuntian also seems to come back, and so it seems like Su Qi may be getting a substitute or equivalent for the Sleeping Beauty princess. The question that sticks in my mind, however, is whether these later stories are more believable than the earlier ones that we've been told. However we answer that question, I think we do have to take into account things like the Postman Bear story that is suddenly inserted or brought back again in chapter 33, the second to last chapter in the novel. You may get lost looking for him, and even if you find him, he will eventually disappear. He will leave you behind. So it seems like his typical act is to vanish before your eyes. So will we get there in the end? Will we attain this ideal state of perfection? Will we meet our prince or our princess? I feel like in the end there is an undercutting of this fairy tale logic of living happily ever after. There is so much that is unknowable. We don't know if Sleeping Beauty is ever going to wake up. And there's so much that is unattainable. And so maybe, like Su Qi, our inclination is to turn to substitutes, including the substitute of stories and the imagination.